in just a little bit. Some of y'all are watching on the live stream on different platforms. We're on the Facebook and the YouTube and the X and on a bunch of other stuff. And some of y'all may be watching the recording. We're going to get to it in just a minute. It's an exciting conversation we're going to have on living undivided with Chuck Mingo and Troy Jackson. And we got 2 for 1 tonight. We got both of them here. It's going to be awesome. So I'll introduce them in just a second, but I'm going to do a daring move here and screen share for a few announcements. We got a lot going on this month and a lot going on this week, y'all. So as many of you may know, we in partnership with Raw Tools, one of the other hats that I wear, we get our name from flipping war around, and we chop up guns and turn them into garden tools and all kinds of things. So this month is it's Pride Month. It's also Gun Violence Awareness Month. So there's lots of action on the website and the blog. But one of the things that we're doing is we are blacksmithing 1 minute for every life lost last year. And sadly, it's over 100 lives a day that we're losing in America. We're doing 44,000 for roughly the number of lives lost last year. So, just let that sink in. Like in my lifetime, we've lost more lives to guns in America than in all the casualties of all of America's wars throughout history combined. So we're honoring those lives by transforming guns. That's a little split cross by my buddy Scotty Oots down in North Carolina. We got blacksmiths all over the country. And in fact, our newest is Diana Ostrike from Red Letter Christians, just went to blacksmithing school. So keep an eye out for her. And then we've also got the fast and vigil that's happening at the Supreme Court. So this is in partnership with our friends at Death Penalty Action. For over 20 years, they've been hosting a fast and vigil. And this is why they do it in the middle of the heat. In the end of June and 1st of July, that is the week historically that the U.S. Supreme Court stopped executions at the Supreme Court level, and then several years later allowed executions to resume. And those two decisions in conflict, obviously, at the Supreme Court level are why we host that vigil. Every night, there are some powerful programming from voices of experience, people directly impacted by the death penalty, murder victims' family members, folks that were wrongfully sentenced to die and survived death row and are now exonerated. So keep an eye out for that. Come to DC if you can, or join the evening program for the live stream. Might be able to see most of this here. This is the march. So this coincides with the fast and vigil at the Supreme Court on Saturday. This Saturday, the Poor People's Campaign will be marching on Washington at 10 a.m. So all that stuff's on our website, and you can see there's ways to join locally and to join virtually. But if you can get to DC, jump that way. This week, we're also doing we've been doing a series of webinars that are really practical, and they're really all about getting our voice out there in the public sphere. So we did one on how to write an op-ed, how to publish a book, how to make a reel and do a TikTok video. We also did one on preaching with Michael Waters. So this one is a little different, and it's on direct action, how to organize a vigil or protest. And it's not anecdotal. It's more like some questions to ask, really rooting ourselves in the rich tradition of good trouble. So that's happening this Thursday afternoon. I believe it is June 27th. Ariel and I will rock that together. And then tonight, though, this is what it's all about, y'all. Our book club with Chuck Mingo and Troy Jackson. So welcome, you guys. Let me get my screen off there. And it is so great to be together. Thanks for doing this, y'all.
For sure. Happy to be with you.
Yeah, great to be here.
And I had the advantage of getting to talk with these guys on the podcast, but we're going to dig a lot deeper. We're using the chat. We're also watching it on the different streams as well. So there'll hopefully be some time for conversation. But this book, it's incredible. It's really your all's story individually, but then together about how we're navigating racial justice, and it's called Living Undivided. If y'all don't have it, it's okay if you didn't do your homework and do the reading, but you're going to want to grab this book. The subtitle's Loving Courageously for Racial Healing and Justice. And Chuck is the founder and CEO of Living Undivided. He's been a pastor. He's done all kinds of things, but also is now leading some of this work alongside Troy Jackson, who's the co-founder of Living Undivided. And for a long time, also a pastor, senior pastor of University Christian Church in Cincinnati. So both of them got their families out there, but they're writing from personal experience. And it was a really wonderful thing to read. And I want to start just we can start with you, Chuck, there's that old saying that where we sit determines what we see, and how we experience the world. And I think in a lot of ways, Black folks and white folks experience a different America sometimes, and racial justice has a different lens for us. But I think it's helpful for both of y'all to just share a little bit of your story, because it's so central to the book and your relationship and ministry. So we'll start with you, man. Tell us just a little bit about yourself and why you teamed up with such a character as Troy Jackson to write this book.
He is a character. I agree. And I love him to death. He is my brother for sure. I grew up in Philadelphia, a city that both Shane and I share a great love for. And I may have said this in the podcast, but for the first 5 years of my life, I had a very traditional, if you will, African-American experience growing up in Philadelphia, where the only people that I interacted with that weren't Black were, as I said, my dentist, my doctor, and the Korean owner of the corner store in my neighborhood, Miss Kim, who is still there, by the way. For me, that experience was one that rooted me in faith. Grew up in a family of faith, grew up in the Black church, and then it also rooted me in family and culture. And so a lot of the things that would be traditional experiences of growing up Black in America, I experienced, including when I was 5 years old, transitioning to a private Christian school in the suburbs where I had a minority experience. And while for the most part, that was a super positive experience, that was also the first place where someone called me the N-word. And we talk about this in the book, and just the complexities of being a kid navigating that kind of an offense. But what I would say is my upbringing really helped me to never separate Jesus from justice. So when I think about how the gospel was communicated in my context, it was never devoid of the call for it to show up in the streets, if you will. And so, following in that tradition, that was something that I had in my heart. But most of my experiences from that point forward really were in majority white spaces, including when I moved to Cincinnati and eventually left a job in corporate America to be a pastor, be on the pastoral team of a majority white megachurch. And it was in that experience that I connected with Troy in 2014 and really began a journey that God had been prompting in my heart. But what does it look like to be a voice for racial healing, solidarity, and justice from within that majority white church space and the white evangelical church space? And that's been the journey that Troy and I have really partnered on ever since we met in 2014.
So good. Yeah, and Troy, so a little different upbringing and a little different backdrop from where you're talking about some of these things. So tell us a little bit about that, man.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've been wrestling with the last several years is I grew up in Indiana, and while Indiana is in the north, it also has a very deep kind of Southern ethos to it. So back in the 1920s, when the KKK was at its strongest place in the country was in Indiana. There's a book that came out last year called A Fever in the Heartland it was basically the Klan's plan to take over America and the woman who stopped it. So I highly recommend that book. Not more than Living Undivided, of course, but it's a good one. And the bottom line is that over 50% of the white men in Indiana in the 1920s, so 100 years ago, attended a Klan function. So part of my heritage is I almost certainly had a great grandparent who was attending something with the Klan. And by the way they recruited, their number one recruiting strategy was guess where they recruited for the Klan, Shane? You'll never guess.
Church buffets.
The church.
Lord have mercy.
They would pay stipends to pastors based on the size of their church and recruit people to join the Klan through the church. And that's part of the ugly legacy of Indiana and of the church that we're reckoning with. But so I grew up in that backdrop, and racism was in the water. Basketball was big in Indiana, and my dad coached junior high basketball in Anderson. We had a gym there that had 9,000 seats for high school basketball. My grandparents had season tickets to high school basketball games into their 60s, which I can't imagine as a 55-year-old having season tickets. But it was a religion back in the 70s in Indiana. My dad coached a team that was about half black and half white. And so I'm a 4 or 5-year-old kid, and my first experiences of race were being around my dad's players. And he would occasionally drop some of them off after a game, and I'd be in the back seat, typically surrounded by some young 13 and 14 black basketball players who were my idols. I mean, these were and I think there's something about my calling that is rooted in my earliest experiences around race being positive. But my church taught me the Bible and taught me to read scripture. But anything around race or justice was just not there until I got exposed to, I think it has something to do with Red Letter Christians, Tony Campolo video series when I was 17. I said, what Tony is saying is all over the Bible. And that was part of my journey into this work from when I was a teenager.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of this stuff you talk about this in the book, but it's got to be deliberate work. Others talk about being anti-racist, right? That it's not just being aware of racism, but beginning to be really critical of the things that are shaping us. And I mean, I think that's true regardless. But I mean, for me growing up, I grew up in the Bible Belt, Tennessee. And then I began to see, oh my gosh, I mean, Tennessee I think they made the Bible the official book of Tennessee, but then we still had a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, one of the founders of the KKK, until just a couple of years ago. Right. And so, and I had the Confederate flag on everything. It was on our lunchroom cafeteria trays in my public high school. It was on our football uniforms and fields. So, I mean, some of that was just coming out of it and going, oh my gosh, this has shaped so much. So you give people a lot of tools in the book. Why don't each of you share a little bit about what some of the steps are that people can take to realize their own roots, right? But also to kind of do an audit of the things that are shaping us spiritually too, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we're doing it. Actually, we're modeling one of the things that we start with in every Undivided experience, which is your own story. I think one of the things that is important is that we all have a story when it comes to the ways we've been impacted by racism. And to put a finer point on that, that means my white siblings have a story when it comes to how they've been impacted by racism. So one of the ways that we start Undivided is by inviting people to have a conversation based on a simple question. When's the first time you were aware of race, yours or someone else's? Because that brings all of those stories into the room. And certainly there's some commonalities in those stories. Typically, the people of color have had that experience much earlier in their life. Whereas some, not all, but some of my white brothers and sisters, it's later in life. They may have been in high school when they realized it, or there may have been an experience that they had in college that opened their eyes to something. And we just think that's a really important tool. Is first, it humanizes everyone, right? So part of this is we have to recognize what racism tends to do or wants to do is strip us of the imago Dei. I mean, that's what racism at its core is all about. That's what all kinds of hatred is at its core all about, is stripping us of the image of God that is true for all of us. And we think by tapping into the ability to listen and share a story across race, it's one of the tools that really helps you bring back the humanity that's so necessary to make progress in this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I just to double click on the importance of story. And when we we do a lot of cohorts, and we require at least 30% to be Black, Indigenous, people of color participants. And one of the expectations that's clear throughout is everyone has stories. We just did a gathering. We have a group called a fellowship that we're leading through right now. We just had a question a few weeks ago. When and how did you first become aware of Juneteenth? And it was another I think we had planned for 5 minutes. It went 20, right, Chuck? It was just so
it was a
rich
rich discussion.
in the dichotomies, and those stories are so critical in binding us together. But another thing that we train early on is around empathy, and we have a whole framework around empathy, around what does it mean to not share the same experiences, but have some shared emotions. So we have a framework where we train on a care framework. The C is for choose. You choose to engage, choose to view the other person as valuable, acknowledge their truth is true for them, especially if it's not true for you, that their experiences are different. Recognize the emotion of that experience, and then engage based on that curiosity and empathy and shared emotion. And the example in our training is, if Chuck and I were both pulled over by the police, while the event may be the same, our experiences of that would be very different. Mm-hmm. So Chuck saying he got pulled over and he said, "Oh, I know exactly what that's like," is not true. But if Chuck's able to express fear, anger, just being petrified, being nervous, I can relate to what did I need when I went through some of those emotions. So that training, I think, is really key in a way to move forward in a positive way toward racial healing and justice. Yeah,
and so it makes so much sense to start with the personal and the stories, but you're not, you immediately invite people to do some hard work on history too, right? Really confronting the bigger story and the mythology of America, right? I mean, I think that's one of the things that when you really start to look at this, you see that there's a paradox. We've got a lot of wonderful aspirational things in our founding documents. All men are created equal, and yet the people that wrote that owned Black folks and sold them as property. And so there's kind of this like paradox even in our own history. And right now it feels like there's a war over that history. So I'd love to hear like both of you kind of talk about, we can each have our stories, but we can't each have our facts or our truths, right? Like there's a point where we've got to really confront and be honest about history, because the truth does set us free. And like Dr. King said, the more we try to bury the ugly parts of our history, it's like an untreated wound. It only gets worse and becomes more and more toxic to us. So you want to start, Troy, saying a little bit about, like, because this is a section of the book on confronting history.
Yeah, so we do a couple things. One is we want to try to share what is systemic and structural racism, because that's being contested right now. And about a year and a half ago, we were trying to, or maybe it was a couple of years ago, we were trying to figure out how do we bring a story that shows what this is really like. And Chuck remembers this. I started reading like everything I could read about Flint, Michigan.
Yeah.
And the question was, how does a city poison its people with lead-based water? That just so happens to be a majority Black city. And turns out it's like 100 years of legacy racism. Mm-hmm. You don't just end up with poison water in 2012 out of the blue. There's been a lack of opportunity at General Motors, where Black folks who would try to work there were limited to the hardest jobs, either custodial or working right in the heat of where the iron was shaped. And then neighborhoods that they weren't and were not allowed to live in. And then slum clearance, where they declared the Black neighborhoods in Flint slums in 1960, but didn't actually clear them till 1970. So guess what happened to the property values of those Black homeowners with a disinvestment of a decade? And then, of course, as the city becomes more Black, white flight happens, there's disinvestment. There's a foundation that supports some of the best schools in the country. As soon as the city turns to majority Black, they say, we're no longer going to enable public education. They need to handle it on their own. And then there's an infrastructure set up for 200,000 people, and there's only 80,000 folks. And if the water bills for Black Flint are 3 times as large as for the township right next door, and they try to solve for that. It's just a cascading example. They don't have home rule anymore. The governor takes over. And so I think one of the things we want to say is dig deep into wherever you are. Flint's a great example, but you can go to Jackson, Mississippi. You can go to parts of Philadelphia. You can go to places in Indiana. Gary, Indiana would be an example. And look at how race has been part of the story over time in the way that that racism tends to minimize voice, narrow opportunity, and limit movement. And those are 3 things that we think systemic racism does over and over again. But we also, and Chuck, maybe you can talk to this, we also say it's important for us to talk about some of the good parts of history. Because we've had so many books about the negative stuff. When have we kind of gotten it right?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
And we talk about that. And the subtitle there is Remember the Titans. I love that movie, Remember the Titans, story of the TC football team in the 70s. And what we do in the chapter in the book is we highlight some of the places where the church has gotten it right, where the church has been at the forefront of the movement for racial healing and justice. And one of the places is actually right near where Troy lives, New Richmond, Ohio, small town. But this is a town where there was a powerful anti-slavery abolition movement afoot. They had a publication, and people who were for enslavement burned the publication down. Well, the community got together and protected this place as it was being rebuilt. There was a pastor and a faith leader, very similar, actually was connected to Lane Seminary, which obviously produced Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin. This leadership and the church leadership in New Richmond said they will disfellowship with any church that doesn't agree that slavery is against the heart of Jesus. And so we call out these stories, Chinatown Rising. There was a powerful thing happening in Chinatown, and just the way that the church there, the Chinese followers of Jesus, were creating opportunities to help people who were being trafficked or otherwise being disenfranchised because of being Chinese. And so we tell these stories to say there are places and ways in which the church got it right. And Shane, the thing I would say about all of this is I think about this need to confront history is this is utterly biblical. This is utterly the way of Jesus. You said this, and I know that you believe this. Jesus meant what he said when he said, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. He meant that. And if we believe that, we can't shy away from the truth. And one of the scriptures that I often bring to bear in this conversation is 2 Corinthians 7:10, which says godly sorrow. Because oftentimes the reason we don't want to confront this truth is because, and even some of the rhetoric out there is, well, it's going to make people feel uncomfortable. What's interesting what the Bible says about what happens when you feel sorrowful. In 2 Corinthians 7:10, it says, godly sorrow leads to repentance, which brings more salvation and leaves no regret. And I just would say to anyone, why wouldn't you want those benefits? A deep repentance that leads to more salvation. And we know that in the Bible, salvation isn't just about going to heaven, right? Salvation is about healing. It's about deliverance. It's about experiencing the kingdom right here on earth. And it leaves no regret. I think sometimes we get stuck as a country because we have not allowed ourselves to fully enter into repentance for this history. And so we continue to be in a cycle of regret and protection, and it keeps us from moving forward.
So good. I was thinking of those concrete examples. You give a good shout out to Berea down in Kentucky.
Yes, Berea, Kentucky.
Yeah.
Yep, we talked about that.
Black History Week and Black History Month come out of Carter Woodson, who was a student there in a window. Yeah.
Yeah, it made me proud. It's been a little while since I've been down there, but and I was thinking of, Duke Kwan and Gregory Thompson. Have you read the reparations book that they wrote? We featured it in one of the book clubs, but they do the same work that you all do of trying to celebrate honestly the church at its worst and the church at its best. I think they call it the faithful and the failure, like that those are often even happening at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So when we look at history, a part of what we've done is created sort of different spiritualities of personal salvation and of social transformation, and I think it affects a whole lot of different layers of society, but you all are kind of holding those together. But I think it also is, it's not just salvation, but it's also sin, right? We think sin is
Yeah.
personal. So we need,
Yeah.
we need people that have racism in their heart for God to heal that. And that's true. But there's also a part of this that systems and structures are human, and they sin impacts them too, from banks to housing to the education system to being able to get a loan. I mean, I even think of like, the study of that house where when they thought it was a white owner, it was one price, and
Yes.
or the Freakonomics study where they send the exact
Yeah.
same resume out. The only thing that's different is the name. And when the name is Jaquil instead of Jason, or Mohammed instead of Matthew, it influences how employers respond. So, but this isn't a choice of either or, right? So maybe Chuck, we'll start with you of how we think of the holy work of God, right? Of healing hearts, healing our world, and why we can't kind of divide those.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll go straight to the words of Jesus. Matthew to the red letters. That feels fitting to go to the red letters, right?
Hallelujah.
Matthew 23, and that litany of woes that Jesus is calling out for the Pharisees. He says this, he says, woe to you because you tithe on your mint, your cumin, your dill, but you've neglected the weightier matters of the law. And he says the weightier matters of the law are justice and mercy and righteousness. And so I think what Jesus is saying there is you can't, I think Tim Keller has said it this way, you cannot separate your private piety from your public righteousness. Like the Bible does not allow you to separate those two things. And Jesus models that. We certainly see that in the Old Testament as we think about the way that God designed the law to not just be about the personal offense, but gleaning and jubilee and all these things were really about corporate, right? And even recognizing corporate sin and how that needed to be dealt with. I mean, there was very much a corporate sense of understanding the relationship that the nation of Israel had with God. And I think Jesus continues that with the church. And so I think you're absolutely right. And what we try to do in Undivided is we've been in America overdeveloped on the individual salvation. Troy does an amazing teaching in our cohort based on Isaiah 58 and what is a true fast. And, he really talks about like absolutely personal righteousness, personal salvation. I'm so glad that Jesus came and he saved Chuck Mingo. I'm so glad. And yet you can't read that. You can't live into this without reckoning with the corporate call. So that justice call is very much about community, right? It's about treating workers well. It's about, being, and how do we become the restorer of streets to dwell in, the builder of age-old ruins? We do that by this corporate response to the ways in which we've been changed in our walk with Jesus. And so I do think that that's something that the church has an opportunity to live into more fully. And here's what I would say. I think it's one of the differentiators that the next generation of young people are looking for from the church.
It's good.
I think where they see that, they're turning their head. Yeah.
So good. I absolutely agree. I want to come to you in just a second, Troy, but I was thinking of going back to the story and why our stories are important, is that there's a humility in realizing, like, just because something I haven't experienced something doesn't mean it's not real, right? And in fact, I think Alexis Salvatierra says privilege is being able to choose which issues we care about and which ones we don't. And just because something doesn't impact me doesn't mean that it hasn't impacted my neighbor. And to love my neighbor means to care about this. But I think like the studies over and over, when people are asked about policing, right? White folks overwhelmingly, like 75%, say it's a few bad apples, right? You have bad cops just like you have anything. There's also a comedian that said, some jobs you just can't have a bad apple. Like, your airline pilot can't be like, I land most of the time, But anyway, that aside. But then when people are, people of color are asked over and over, they go, no, it's bigger. It affects the whole system, the criminal justice system, the policing system. And so, there's this interplay. And so I think, Troy, I want to hear your thoughts on that too, but how we kind of hold these together and how we invite people to think about systemic racism when maybe they haven't experienced it, at least in a way that they can wrap their hands around.
Yeah, the grand narrative of the Hebrew Scriptures and the Old Testament is the Exodus story. And the Exodus story is not the people crying out and Moses coming in and saying, let's figure out a more comfortable slavery. Let's start a tutoring program, or let's do some housing repairs. It's a liberation campaign from the get-go. And the cry is, let my people go. And in fact, if you think about, when does the law come into play? The law is given in the shadow of the Exodus. It's not given before this grand justice movement. And I can't help believe that the Hebrew people understood that connection deeply, right? They had experienced the liberation of God from enslavement through the Red Sea into freedom. And so the way that we have pulled those apart, I think, would be unimaginable to Moses and Aaron and Miriam and the original folks who departed out of Egypt. And I think the same, like Jesus starts with those words that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, right? To preach good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, release for the captives, declaring the year of the Lord's favor. It's so much a part of Jesus' public ministry. And I've heard Chuck talk about this a lot, that we talk about the great revivals. We had a little bit of a flare up in Kentucky last year, I think, a little revival happening. And we think about the First Great Awakening and George Whitefield, and we think about the Second Great Awakening and Charles Grandison Finney and others who are inviting people. And Finney would, Jim Wallace would always talk about this, that Finney would have people come to Jesus and then sign them up to be part of the abolitionist movement. But Chuck's brought up recently that we don't usually think of the civil rights movement as a revival, but it was a revival. It was a revival of the Spirit of God, capturing something that we had lost or tossed away or veered from about the very character of God, around the human dignity and liberation of all people. And that racism is a stain upon God and upon us. I think that's one thing I would say about when it comes to racism too, is going back to Alexia, who's amazing. What I would say about racism is, when we think it doesn't affect us as white people, we're lying. It affects us spiritually. I think it hurts us all. It pits us against each other. We're not well as a society. We're not well as a people. We're not well as white people, as white men in this society. It's partly because we have given in to a hierarchy of human concern and divided ourselves from our kindred of color who are followers of Jesus or not. We have separated ourselves. And I think it comes at great mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical cost.
Yeah, and as we even think about the framework for discipleship, for theology, in a lot of Christian colleges and seminaries, when you take theology classes, you learn from the white folks, mostly white men, and then you can take optional classes in African American theology or liberation theology, and we sometimes don't do this kind of internal work of saying, how does that affect the church? How does it, because I think a lot of what we're experiencing right now is a spiritual formation and discipleship crisis. So, you both are also have pastoral hearts. And so maybe say just a little bit more about the spiritual side of this, right? It is a social injustice issue, but this is also like really deeply goes into the formation of what it means to be the people of Jesus, right, in the world right now.
Absolutely. I want to just say, like, it's an exciting opportunity. Oftentimes we think about this as a challenge to problem, and it is. It's also an exciting opportunity. I was having this conversation with a group of pastors, and I said, think about all the things you get to bump up against when you're on this journey of understanding God's heart for justice. High view of scripture. You get to bump up against, how do you read the scripture? call to community and doing life together. You get to come up with it. You're gonna get to bump up against suffering, because there's gonna be suffering in this, and we know what suffering and learning how to be formed by suffering does. The power of prayer. There are all these opportunities kind of embedded in this moment where we get to disciple people on so many of the things that are part of becoming a mature follower of Jesus anyway. But we get to do love of neighbor, right? What did Jesus say? The law is summed up by love of God and love of neighbor. You get to touch on all these things. So I think you're right, Shane, that, for spiritual folks out there, whether it's a parent forming a child, whether it's a pastor forming a community, a small group leader forming a small group, I think there's an opportunity to leverage these conversations around race and justice and the work of race and justice, building racial unity and justice, that actually create opportunities to make mature followers of Jesus who are ready to really stand and be Jesus in the context that they live in right now. So it's an opportunity. It's an exciting opportunity.
Yeah. And Troy, I want to hear your thoughts on that too. I mean, you give a lot of great resources in the book, but I think it's helpful for people to hear some of those. Obviously part of what we're trying to do at Red Letter Christians is, we say change the narrative by changing the narrators, right? Centering voices of folks that have been, historically marginalized, folks that have been, even, just having Munther Isaac here from Palestine, from the West Bank, and hearing his love for Jesus, but also like it reorients you when you realize that some of the oldest Christianity is in this, in Gaza and in the West Bank and in Iraq and in these places, right? Like America's not the center of the world. In fact, we're 200 years old. Like in the grand scheme of things, we're a young little experiment. And so, Troy, you want to say a little bit more about the kind of spiritual dynamic that's happening and how people can maybe do a better job at doing an audit of the books on our shelves and the podcasts we're listening to, and thinking through like, how do I make sure that I'm listening to diverse voices that are going to really deepen my own faith?
Yeah, I think that's critical. I think, and we could go down whether it's what podcast you're listening to or books on tape or what you're reading, who you're quoting. If you're pulling sermons together, who are you citing? I'm reading a manuscript right now from Mark Nelson and a co-writer, and saw a quote from James Baldwin there in the introduction. I'm thinking, okay, we're going somewhere here, right? Because there's a deliberate attempt to say that the authorities are not just, as you mentioned, the same white men over and over and over again. And so I think that's really critical. I think the other piece I would say, and we say this a lot, I say it in different ways, that Micah 6:8, which is that famous verse, what does the Lord require of you? That, the way I like to read that verse is that, what does the Lord require of you but to get a PhD in justice and love mercy and walk humbly, or read a book about justice and love mercy and walk humbly, or join a book club. It doesn't say anything. It says do justice. And so I think that's the piece I'd really implore is, yes, diversify, but also do justice, but do it in a way where I'm not setting the table. I often joke, and Shane, I think you could probably relate to this, that that when a white evangelical guy finds out there's a problem in the world, we think we're the very first people to ever discover it, and that we are the solution God's been waiting for. Like God wired us to solve it. Like people, as Alexius Altiera says, there's people that have known this is an issue. They've been doing good work on it. It's not for us to come solve and save, right? That's colonialism. Yeah. That's the worst. So one of the things that we really talk about in the book, and I'll say this as a white guy, it's important for me to follow and submit and be yoked with Black and brown leaders. This is not a solo sport. It's not getting a bunch of white folks together to go save something or someone. Jesus handles that. And if I'm really going to be someone who is on the journey of racial healing, solidarity, and justice, I've got to be yoked with someone like Chuck Mingo and follow him and submit to his leadership.
Cool.
That's where things gets real.
Hey, if y'all are just tuning in, this is the book we're talking about. It's our book club book of the month, Living Undivided. And we've got both Chuck and Troy on here. If you are on the Zoom here, you can use the chat. And if you're on Facebook or YouTube, you can also put comments in, and we're trying to monitor those too. We're going to be watching for those, and hopefully have a little time for Q&A in a minute. But it also seems like that's how the relationships are how we sustain this, right? Like how we continue to do this work. I mean, if you just read books on anti-racism and you listen to all the podcasts, I mean, it can get really heavy. So you've got a whole section of the book that I thought is really powerful. It's on resisting weariness and powerlessness. And you know, you talk about playing not to lose, but you're also talking about kind of like this, it's hopeful, right? Like we can, we know that change can happen. We've seen it happen. We know that these principalities and powers are big and real, but we know that God is bigger. And so talk a little bit about how we kind of defiantly resist that weariness and powerlessness. We can start with you, Chuck. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so thankful for my friendship with Troy. I say this a lot that, in the years that we've been journeying together, 10 years as friends, what Troy has done consistently is called me up I should put in this order. He's called me in and he's called me up. He's called me in to a relationship of trust and authenticity. Troy knows when I'm putting on, he would say when I'm doing my P&G speak, when I'm doing my corporate speak and maybe not fully being authentic with him about what I'm really wrestling with. And he has a way of challenging me to come in, to lean in. And that's a really powerful thing. And then from that, to call me up. And what I mean by that is Troy is great at having these I see in you conversations. We get that phrase from a good friend of ours, wrote the foreword of the book, Dave Ferguson. I see in you a leader who can do this. I see in you someone who is growing in this area. And I just think, man, having that kind of yokeship, having that kind of relationship is so important in this work. And so I'm really grateful for that. And I would encourage, we talk about in the book, if you feel like, man, I don't know anybody, we talk about, well, look up, look around, and look again. Because oftentimes God has placed people in our circle, in our sphere. It might require us to step forward. It might require us to take an authentic step. But that's a powerful way to be sustained in this work. We do this together. This is not a solo sport.
Yeah, and it's interesting just how personalities meld and shape. I tend to be more the prophetic, seeing what's wrong in the world. And Chuck has this resilience and hope that I need. Because I can get a little down and I can get cynical, which doesn't do anybody any favors. So Chuck's always leaning into faith, hope, and love, and really elevates hope for me. I think about the most fundamental, the first problem in Scripture doesn't happen with the fall. It happens when God says it's not good for man to be alone. And there is this fundamental need and longing. One of our most fundamental needs is to belong. And part of the crisis we're in right now that's being manipulated by politicians and by forces working for evil is to isolate and pit us against each other and to build belonging based on hate and othering. And so part of, I think, the resistance and what Jesus calls us to, and we see this in the church in Antioch. We see this all throughout the New Testament and the best of church's history. In John 17, Jesus' prayer that they will know that Jesus is God's Son when we are united. We can have a different kind of belonging with each other, a belonging that includes a Messianic Christian and a Palestinian Christian, can include a Black Christian, a white Christian, who are not just agreeing to getting along to get along, but are in the tension together and staying with each other because we belong to Jesus and we belong to one another.
I want to so there's the friendship piece of it. There's also the community piece of it that you talk about, and I think Dr. King, one of his really famous lines was that the most segregated hour in the world is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, but he really grieved the ways that the church conformed to the forces of segregation. And yet, for a lot of folks, like the historic Black church has been a really safe, liberating space. And Troy, it's hard to know, like, when people leave the kind of Trump evangelicalism, the white evangelicalism that's been really toxic, like, where do you go? Do you join a church where you're a minority as a white person? And maybe it's not anecdotal, but maybe just offer a few thoughts on that. Like, I think we have a lot of people that listen to and join book clubs like this that they may have left a faith community, but they haven't exactly built a new one yet. So maybe speak into that a little bit. Start with you, Chuck. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm just looking, Evie wrote the question very similar to this. How does a white church get to know a Black church? And I think it's connected. I think what I would say is there is an opportunity to bridge, but it always requires risk. There's no way to do it without risk. And so one of the things that I often like to do is put myself in environments where the people around me think different than me or have some aspect of their culture that's different than mine. It's one of the reasons I love traveling, is to have that experience. And oftentimes what I tell people, somebody asked that same question, Shane, you were asking, and I said, how do you do it? Phone a friend. Who's a person in your life who's familiar to you, right? Who you trust and who you know, who you could say, hey, I'm on a journey of trying to figure out how to broaden some friendships and relationships. Would you go with me to this AME church, this African Methodist Episcopal Church? Or would you where are those opportunities to step in and explore with someone? Because I do think there's opportunity to get connected there. And I grieve how many people right now are wrestling with a spiritual home because of a lot of the ways in which this has been just so politicized. And so I just lament that and would encourage people who are in that space to bring that lamentation to God and really ask God to lead them to new opportunities. I think if you're in a denomination, maybe there are churches in the denomination that have a different cultural makeup, but the tradition is the same. Maybe that's a place to start. Think about those places where you can step in and maybe begin to learn and explore and experiment. I think it's okay to experiment. It's okay if the first step doesn't work, but be encouraged and don't give up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Troy, go ahead, man.
Yeah,
Thanks, Chuck.
I think too, don't wait for somebody else to solve it for you. If we're waiting for our pastor or the church leadership to build some great bridge, we don't have to wait. And I don't know if Evie, if you're a pastor or not, but who do you want to build some bridges with in your community? And we often think, I think we can give into stereotypes that, well, our community isn't diverse, but the census would say otherwise, that even rural communities are becoming more and more diverse by the day in this country. There are opportunities out there. It just takes taking the risk and stepping into some new space. The other thing it's part of the roots of us being on this call, I think, Shane, is Undivided. We've just started this monthly worship space on second Sunday of the month, 7 p.m. Eastern. We had a guy named Shane Claiborne join us back in April. But we have a guest, and there's breakout rooms, and it's diverse racially and ethnically. And we're just trying to provide a space for people who love Jesus and care deeply about justice and are longing for community. Because we know there are a lot of people really wrestling and struggling with church right now. And we want to make sure there are good spaces of belonging. So if nothing else, if you Google Undivided the Gathering, you will find a space where at least once a month you'll be in a racially and ethnically diverse space and have a chance to do some worship and dialogue with others.
Mm-hmm. Well, keep the questions coming if y'all have them. We're watching for them, and you give a lot of at the end of the book. You give a lot of stories of both. Some are more personal, some are more kind of corporate challenges of what it looks like to reckon with this, and you kind of talk about what reckoning is and what it's not. I think there's a lot of folks that their immediate question is, well, I can't change the past, but what can I do now? And in some ways, like, you don't want to move too fast. I think we want to, like, really deeply unpack the past some, because that informs how we respond and what it looks like to reckon with that. I was just talking about this a little bit with the Anglican Church and Archbishop Justin. Like, what does it look like for the Anglican Church to repair some of the historic harm? Well, that's a different question from what it might look like in Tulsa or what it might look like in Camden, New Jersey, right? So, but even, you know, Zacchaeus, when he has his coming to Jesus moment, when he's born again, it affects his economics, and he starts to challenge the oppressive tax collecting system and do reparations, right? There's some real concrete reckoning that happens in his life. So I don't know if you want to share a story of what that looks like. I know it's not anecdotal, and you did such a good job at saying some of this is about our place, right? It's about our story. Like what it looks like to reckon with this looks different from Troy than it looks like for you, Chuck. And it also looks different depending on, you know, where we are in the world, like what it looks like to heal some of those wounds. So yeah, give us a few thoughts on that though.
I could start. I'll just give an example from, gosh, I think it was 2010. It was right before Thanksgiving. And I was lead pastor of a church, and basically after that Sunday before Thanksgiving happens, I was ready to tune out, and I never preached the Sunday after Thanksgiving. Someone else would do that. And I started getting these Facebook messages about some crazy event, and come to find out, I finally opened one up and saw that an 18-year-old young man from Guatemala who had come to this country at the age of 3 had been arrested and was on a fast track to deportation. And I was on vacation pretty much. I was in my last hour of work for the next week. And I just felt a prompting in the spirit. My son was about the same age that, and by the way, this young man's father was a pastor. I said, if my son was in a bind, would I just go on about my business, or would I want others to step in? And I showed up, and young high school and college students were leading a movement to try to get Bernard released from deportation. And we basically went after that for about a month. And I learned so much, had built new relationships, got involved, got to meet Bernard. We actually saw the White House intervene to get Bernard released. We went there was a DREAM Act vote back in 2010. The DREAM Act had passed the House, and it got to the Senate. We had this thing called the filibuster. So 57 to 41, 57 yes votes for the DREAM Act to 41 no meant there was no DREAM Act. And I got to go into the bowels of the Capitol building with about 250 dreamers, people whose lives had just been toyed with by the US Senate. And there was deep lament and anger and frustration in that room. And the speakers, I think it was Gabby Pacheco and Bernard Pastor and others, brought this faith and resolve and hope and tenacity. It felt like I was in a revival in the midst of some of the deepest pain. And I think about that moment, and it was 18 months later when those same young people had organized others to sit in an Obama re-election headquarters around the country that forced Obama to do what he said he couldn't do, which is to pass DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival. So that's a long story to say I got to experience and be part of this amazing moment because I said I was going to actually pay attention and get involved. And Shane, I think about even from Irresistible Revolution, reading that book back in the day. It's almost been 20 years, hasn't it, since that came out. But you and some of your classmates made a decision not to turn away, but to get involved. Chuck has made those decisions around the preschool campaign. And after Officer Tenzing shot and killed Sam Dubose, to not just turn his head, but to actually come down and be part of the protests and the prayer. I think that's so critical that we not turn away from Gaza right now. We not turn away from Israel. What does it mean to engage and open ourselves up to the adventure God has?
Yeah.
Amen.
Amen. You got anything to add to that, Chuck? Good.
Troy nailed it. I think what I would say to that is, so for listeners, what that looks like practically is, I remember the book Experiencing God by Henry Blackaby. And
I
how
did
he used
that
to
too.
say,
Yeah.
yes. And I remember one of the things that stuck with me is he said, find out where God is working and go join him there. And I would say find out where God is working in your context, in your city, in your region around racial healing and justice, and go join him there. And I believe that that is a powerful step that God honors every time.
So good. Well, in the last few minutes, we'll hear how people can follow you all. But are there any other spaces like, obviously, Red Letter Christians? We're trying to do that, y'all. We're
Absolutely.
also going to be doing some like in-person gatherings. So in August, we're going to be out on the West Coast at New Song with Dave Gibbons doing one of our revivals out there. It's a church that is really all about the same stuff we're talking about tonight. Then we're going to be doing one of our revivals in Philadelphia, it looks like. So Lisa, Sharon Harper, and I are looking at hosting that here and having building around that. But then, you know, a lot of us have found a lot of life in CCDA, the Christian Community Development Association, CCDA. So are there, maybe say some other spaces that folks might feel at home with? Because I think part of when you start asking some of these questions, you're looking to be reminded that you're not alone. And it's always refreshing when there are fellow Christians that also care about racial justice and healing. So you got any other places where people either in real time, real space, or virtually they can join, and we'll make sure that you get another pitch for the Undivided, because that's a wonderful project. But Chuck, you or Troy got other like refreshing spiritual spaces in the world that we should know about?
Yeah, I mean, you named the ones that I would name. I would just double click. We're going to be at CCDA this year, and just have found that to be a really life-giving community of people who are kind of in struggle together as it relates to these matters. And so, just would highly recommend the CCDA conference, and we're going to be there. We're going to be doing a workshop there this year. So, just would love to connect with some of the folks that are on this call, even if you're going to make it out there. I think it's in Seattle this year.
Portland. Yeah, cool.
Portland, that's right.
Yeah, Portland. And you mentioned Lisa Sharon Harper. She has the great organization Freedom Road and just does so much great work. I think of people like Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil and some of the work she's doing out in Seattle. She has a new book out too, maybe a good one for the book club. There's so many great voices, and there are folks that are doing work on the ground. I'm involved in a lot of community organizing, and I think looking around for what community organizing is going on, who's particularly doing multiracial, multi-ethnic, sometimes even multi-faith work to address racial and economic injustice at the local and state and even federal level. I mean, that's part of what the Poor People's Campaign event that you highlighted at the beginning is about, right? How do we build collective power to bring some change? So there's local groups all over this country. Faith in Action's a group I'm connected with that has federations like Power in Pennsylvania.
With a new executive director of the Bishop Dwayne Royster.
Yeah.
I just saw that. We've been doing a lot of organizing here in Philly with him, so he's a dear brother. So cool.
So he's going to be leading the national group, I think, maybe as of today. So and by the way, when you say Dave Gibbons' name, about 4 years ago, we did a walk from Charlottesville to DC, and one of the indelible memories is that Dave Gibbons had a blister that was bigger than his foot.
I've never seen anything like it in my life. I have bad dreams about that blister.
Yeah, so I'm hoping it's gotten a little better. So when you see Dave, make sure to check on that.
Yeah, heck yeah. Well, it's been a rich hour, y'all. This is the book, Living Undivided. You can get it anywhere that they have good books, but you can also get it at undivided.us and /book, right? So it's there. Tell us how we can follow you guys, continue the conversation, and one more pitch for the wonderful Undivided virtual gatherings happening.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you got it. Our website, undivided.us. You can find out more about the work we do. You can reach out and we'll get in contact with you. So you can reach out to me or Troy, and we'd be happy to follow up with you there. And then you can follow us on social medias at Living Undivided as well.
Sweet. Well, y'all, that's book club for this month. We always try to do our events so that money is never an obstacle to getting to have great conversations like this. So if you do have anything you want to give, you can do it at redletterchristians.org, even just a small gift, or sign up to be a monthly sustainer and get our newsletters and all that stuff. We don't even put a money amount on there. It's just like, I want to be a part of this. I'm going to give $10 a month or whatever, or just pray for this movement. But we love giving a small gift to our wonderful friends like Troy and Chuck. So we're going to do that tonight, but make sure you get their book, write them a review of it. And yeah, it's great, y'all. And look for opportunities to be together, y'all. Some of us will be in DC this weekend. I'm coming out to Ohio, y'all, with the Forge. I'm for the Festival of Nonviolence. We're going to be in like
Oh, cool.
cities melting guns down. I don't have the details on there on the top of my head, but can't wait. But let's keep looking for excuses to hang out, y'all. And nothing beats being together in person, but it's also really, really wonderful to have the conversation tonight. So grab the book. Thanks, y'all. I will hopefully see you both soon. So thanks
Very
again.
soon.
Thanks, Shane.
Yep.